I found my mother's diary on the third day of clearing out her house, tucked inside a hatbox she'd kept on the top shelf of her closet for as long as I could remember. And one line on the very first page I opened made my hands go cold. Today David took another $600 from my account. I let him. I always let him. He doesn't know that I know. My name is Hannah. My mother Ruth passed away 2 months ago, quietly, in her sleep, at 73. She'd lived alone in the same small house for over 20 years, ever since my father died, and it fell to me, the daughter who lived 20 minutes away, rather than my brother David, who lived 3 states over and visited twice a year at most, to go through her things. I want to say, before anything else, that I didn't go into that house looking for anything. I went in expecting exactly what you'd expect. Old photographs, my father's tools still in the garage, decades of a quiet, unremarkable life that I'd need to carefully pack into boxes and decide what to keep. My mother was, by every appearance, an unremarkable woman in the best sense of that word. She clipped coupons. She reused tinfoil. She wore the same cardigan to church for what felt like a decade, mending the elbow herself rather than buying a new one. If you'd asked anyone in our extended family to describe her, they would have used words like frugal, careful, modest. Never poor, exactly, because my father had left her comfortably enough situated when he died, with a paid-off house and a reasonable pension, but she lived like someone watching every dollar, and everyone, myself included. Simply that was just who she was. A woman shaped by an earlier, harder generation, who never quite learned to relax into comfort even once she had it. My brother David is, in almost every visible way, the opposite. He's 41, runs what he describes, vaguely and often, as a consulting business, drives a car that's replaced every 2 or 3 years, and has spent the last decade cultivating a specific reputation within our family. The successful one, the one who made it, the one our mother, according to David himself, was endlessly proud of. He'd tell stories at holidays about deals he'd closed, clients he'd impressed, always slightly too detailed to be entirely comfortable, always landing, somehow, on how proud Mom was of him. I believed it, mostly, the way you believe things about siblings you don't see very often. From a distance, without much scrutiny, because scrutinizing it would have required a kind of attention I simply never thought to give. I want to be honest that I hadn't thought much, in recent years, about why our mother lived so carefully, while her supposedly successful son lived so comfortably. It's the kind of question that only becomes obvious in hindsight, once you already know the answer. Before you know it, it just looks like 2 people who happen to have different relationships with money, and nobody thinks to ask why. The hatbox was near the back of her closet shelf, behind a stack of old quilts, and I almost didn't open it. I'd already found 2 similar boxes that day, both full of nothing more significant than old greeting cards and church bulletins. This one had 6 spiral notebooks in it, cheap ones, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, each labeled on the cover, with a range of years in my mother's careful handwriting. Sat down on the floor of her closet, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and opened the one marked with the most recent years. The entry that stopped me cold was dated almost exactly a year before she died. Today David took another $600 from my account. I let him. I always let him. He doesn't know that I know. I read that sentence 4 or 5 times before it fully landed. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't a single clean emotion, it was several things colliding at once. Confusion, first, because the sentence implied a pattern, a habit, something ongoing rather than a single request for help. And then something colder underneath the confusion. A slow dawning understanding that my mother had known something, for a long time, that she had deliberately never told me. I kept reading. I sat on that closet floor for almost 3 hours, going backward through the notebooks, piecing together a timeline that took my breath away by the time I finished. It began, as far as I could tell from the earliest entries, about 15 years ago, not long after my father died. David, apparently struggling with a failed business venture he'd never once mentioned to me, had come to our mother, grieving, freshly widowed, alone in that house for the first time in 30 years, and asked for help. Not once. Repeatedly. What started, according to her careful, restrained entries, as a genuine short-term loan during a difficult period, slowly became something else entirely. A standing arrangement, unspoken, unacknowledged, where David would simply take money from an account he still had access to from years earlier, when he'd helped manage some of her affairs after my father's death, and my mother would notice, and say nothing. I found entries where she describes confronting him once, early on, gently, asking when he thought he might be able to pay some of it back. I found his response, recorded in her own words, dismissive, slightly wounded, framing her question as a lack of trust, an unwillingness to help family in need. I found her own conclusion, written with a kind of resigned clarity that broke something in me to read. I will not be the reason this family falls apart over money. I would rather live carefully and keep peace than force a fight I'm not sure any of us could survive. 15 years. 15 years of a woman quietly funding her son's carefully maintained image of success, mending her own cardigans and reusing tinfoil, while he drove a new car every few years, and told stories at holidays about how proud she was of him. Stories that, I now understood with a sick, sinking clarity, were partly true and partly a performance built on money that was never really his to spend. I want to be honest about something else I found in those pages, because it complicates the story in a way I think matters. My mother wasn't naive, she wasn't confused about what was happening. Her entries show a woman who understood, with total clarity, exactly what her son was doing, and who made a deliberate, ongoing choice. One she revisited and reconsidered many times over the years, according to the entries, to prioritize the appearance of family peace over confronting a truth that might have fractured us permanently. I don't know, even now, if I agree with that choice. But I understand it in a way I didn't expect to. There was a period, according to the diary, around 8 years ago, where she'd apparently considered cutting him off entirely, had even drafted a letter. I found a folded copy of it tucked into that same notebook, never sent, explaining that she could no longer continue supporting what she called the version of you that isn't real. She never sent it. The next entry, dated about 2 weeks later, simply says, I tore up the letter. He's still my son. I would rather he think I'm foolish than lose him entirely. I sat with that for a long time. I think, of everything I read that day, that particular entry affected me the most. Not the theft itself, but the quiet, deliberate grief of a mother choosing, again and again, over 15 years, to protect a relationship by absorbing a betrayal she fully understood, rather than risk losing her son by naming it out loud. The most recent notebook, the one covering the last year of her life, was different in tone from the earlier ones. More tired, I think, more resigned, though also somehow, more clear-eyed. There's an entry from about 4 months before she died where she writes, almost as an aside, that she'd finally told her accountant everything, all of it, the full 15 years, and had begun quietly documenting each instance of David accessing her accounts, with dates and amounts, in case Hannah ever needs to understand, after I'm gone, why things were the way they were. The very last page of that final notebook, and I want to describe this carefully, because it's the detail that changed everything about how I understood the weeks that followed, contains a single name I didn't recognize, along with a date about 6 weeks after she died. No explanation, no context. Just a name, Patricia Colwell, and that date, underlined twice. I didn't know what to make of it, not at first. I put the notebooks aside for several days, unable to fully process what I'd read, unsure what, if anything, I was supposed to do with 15 years of my mother's carefully documented, carefully hidden grief. I finally called her accountant, a woman named Diane who'd handled my mother's finances for over a decade, hoping she might be able to shed some light on the name in that final entry. Diane, it turned out, already knew a considerable amount. My mother had, as the diary suggested, spent her final months quietly organizing detailed records of every transfer David had made over the years, working with Diane to build a clear, undeniable paper trail, though she'd been vague, according to Diane, about what she ultimately intended to do with it. Diane didn't recognize the name Patricia Colwell either, but she did something I hadn't expected. She pulled up my mother's recent email correspondence, which she'd had limited access to for tax purposes, and found a short exchange from several months before Ruth's death. Patricia Colwell, it turned out, was a family law attorney. My mother had consulted her, briefly, about something Diane's records didn't fully clarify, but the date in the diary, we soon realized together, lined up almost exactly with a court hearing date. David's own divorce hearing, which I hadn't even known was happening, since he'd never mentioned separating from his wife, Karen, at all. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that still unsettles me the most. I called Karen, my brother's wife, someone I'd always liked but rarely spoken to directly, to ask, carefully, if she knew anything about our mother, reaching out to a family law attorney before she died. There was a long pause on the phone, long enough that I understood, before she said anything, that I'd stumbled onto something significant. Karen told me quietly that she and David had, in fact, been separating for the better part of a year, something David had asked her to keep private from the rest of the family until finances were sorted out. She told me something else too. That during the divorce proceedings, David's finances had come under far more scrutiny than he'd expected, and that Karen's own attorney had begun asking pointed questions about a series of unexplained transfers from an elderly relative's account over the years. Transfers that, if formally documented, could significantly affect how the divorce settlement was calculated, since money David claimed as his own consulting income appeared, on closer inspection, to include funds that were never actually his. It became clear, piecing all of this together, that my mother, in her final months, quietly, without telling either of her children, had reached out to Patricia Colwell not out of vindictiveness, but out of a specific, careful concern that David's divorce might expose exactly the pattern she'd spent 15 years trying to keep hidden, and she wanted, in whatever time she had left, to make sure the full truth existed somewhere reliable, in case it mattered later, in case I needed to understand, in case the family needed protecting from a mess she could see coming, even if nobody else could yet. I don't fully know what my mother intended to happen with all of this. I don't think she was trying to destroy David. I think, reading through those diaries again and again in the weeks since, she was doing something more complicated and more heartbreaking than that. Quietly preparing a truth she'd protected her whole life. Positioning it carefully, so that it would only surface if it needed to, rather than detonating it herself while she was still alive to see the fallout. I made a decision, in the end, that I've gone back and forth on many times since. I didn't confront David directly, not with anger, not as an accusation. I called him, calmly, and told him I'd found Mom's diaries. I told him I knew about the 15 years. I gave him space to respond however he needed to, and what followed was a long, difficult, mostly quiet conversation, punctuated by long silences, in which he didn't fully deny anything, though he also didn't fully own it the way I might have wanted him to. He talked about the failed business, about shame, about not knowing how to stop once it started, about genuinely believing, for a long time, that he'd eventually pay it all back, once things turned around, a turnaround that, 15 years later, had simply never come. I didn't demand repayment. I didn't threaten to expose him publicly, to Karen's attorney or to the rest of the family. I made one request, the same request I think our mother would have made if she'd ever found the courage to send that letter she tore up 8 years earlier. That he stopped performing a version of success that was never real. That he finally tell the truth to the people closest to him, starting with himself. I don't know if he will. Some patterns, I've come to understand, are extremely difficult to break, even once they're fully exposed. What I do know is that our mother spent 15 years quietly protecting a version of family peace that, I now understand, cost her far more than any of us ever realized. Years of careful frugality that weren't really about generational thriftiness at all, but about a woman absorbing an ongoing betrayal, so the rest of us could keep believing in a story that was only half true. I think about her diary entries often now, especially the one where she wrote about tearing up that letter, choosing to keep believing her son was foolish, rather than lose him entirely. I don't know if I would have made the same choice. I don't think there's a clean, satisfying answer to whether she was right. But I understand her more fully now than I did before I opened that hatbox. Not as the quietly frugal, slightly old-fashioned woman I'd always assumed she was, but as someone who made an extraordinarily difficult, ongoing sacrifice, for 15 years, to hold a family together that, in the end, may have never been as together as she hoped. I've kept the diaries. I don't know yet what I'll eventually do with them, whether I'll ever show them to anyone else, whether the truth they contain needs any further public reckoning, beyond the conversation David and I have already had. For now, I've simply started doing something my mother, in all her careful documentation, never quite let herself do while she was alive. I've started telling the truth about what actually happened, quietly, to the people who need to understand it, without shouting, without needing anyone's forgiveness or apology in return. I think that's the version of her strength I want to carry forward. More than the frugality, more than the silence. Not the choice to hide the truth to protect a fragile peace, but the quiet, deliberate care she took, right up until the end, to make sure that truth would still exist, waiting patiently in an old hatbox, for exactly the moment someone would finally be ready to find it.